Hello, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barrett.
And I'm Chazza Chidallo.
And there is plenty to chat about this week. As Joe Biden surges ahead in the polls, we'll talk to one expert who fears a constitutional meltdown is looming if Trump refuses to go.
Speaking of the Constitution, Supreme Court has handed down a couple of massive judgments and a certain American president is far from happy.
But first this week to the bombshell book from Donald Trump's former National Security Advisor, John Bolton. It's due to be released next week, although the lawyers are still fighting that out. Preview copies and extracts as well as reviews have already been released this week. Bolton himself has given his first interview to ABC America's Martha Raddatz. His conclusions about his former boss after working with Trump for a bit over a year and a half are pretty scathing.
You described the president as erratic, foolish, behaved irrationally, bizarrely. You can't leave him alone for a minute. He saw conspiracies behind rocks and was stunningly uninformed. He couldn't tell the difference between his personal interests and the country's interests.
I don't think he's fit for office. I don't think he has the competence to carry out the job. There really isn't any guiding principle that I was able to discern other than what's good for Donald Trump's re-election.
Now, there are plenty of John Bolton critics out there. He was too much of a warmonger for even the preemptive war neocons around George W. Bush in the early 2000s. But John Bolton has served 4 American presidents, and to call one of them, Donald Trump, unfit for office and lacking in competence to be president is a very significant rebuke. Previous advisors to presidents have questioned particular decisions, but with the possible exception of Richard Nixon in his final desperate days, nobody's questioned their fundamental fitness and ability to perform the job of president. But here are the key takeaways from the book itself. First, Trump begged China to help him win the election by asking President Xi to start buying more soybeans and wheat from states that were being hardest hit by the trade war. Bolton, he said he was astonished at that gambit, which was all about Trump's re-election hopes and not the national interest. Also, that Trump encouraged Xi to build concentration camps, indicating he had no problem with the imprisoning of 1 million or more Muslim Uyghurs, giving a green light to Chinese human rights abuses. Bolton confirms Ukraine evidence given by the likes of former National Security official Fiona Hill. He says that there clearly was a quid pro quo over Ukraine. Trump was withholding military aid and other things until he got an investigation into Biden and Hillary Clinton. But Bolton also says that the Democrats' impeachment inquiry was too narrow. He says that they should not have just looked at Ukraine, they should have looked at similar abuse of power, even obstruction of justice involving Chinese and Turkish business interests linked to those governments. And he justifies not giving evidence himself because he says it wouldn't have made any difference. He says that he had little to add on Ukraine other than what was already out there. Bolton also says that Trump is a liar and that senior administration officials, including some of those closest to the president, hold him in contempt. Mike Pompeo gets a mention in that particular context, having described the president as being, quote, full of shit. Bolton says that Trump is shockingly uninformed, didn't know the UK has nuclear weapons, and seemed to think that Finland was in Russia, and also came very close to quitting NATO. But we also learn in this almost 600-page book, based on extracts and early reviews, that John Bolton is not a very good writer. He goes into lots of unnecessary detail on mundane things and brushes over important things and manages to come out of the whole story as pretty much the hero of that story. Well, President Trump's response on Twitter will probably go down as a genuine classic of the genre. Enjoy.
Wacko! John Bolton's exceedingly tedious New York Times book is made up of lies and fake stories. Said all good about me in print until the day I fired him. A disgruntled, boring fool who only wanted to go to war. Never had a clue, was ostracized and happily dumped. What a dope.
That is a classic. Okay, first question is, does this book even exist? Is it going to get published?
Yeah, well, it does exist. It's already been shipped around the world. There are copies everywhere, so it's going to be very, very hard to stop. And the grounds for trying to stop it seem shaky at best. But of course, the other question is, does he get to keep the money?
Well, yeah, it's interesting on that. Yeah, I do think it's got to be published because if Trump was going to stop it, he should stop it before every journalist in the world has read it.
Right.
I would suggest.
Yeah.
But yeah, on the money thing, Mark Zaid is a national security lawyer. He deals with this kind of issue for a living, basically, with whistleblower complaints, etc. And he says Bolton is in serious trouble with at least a breach of contract, which is literally a hands-down winner for the government, according to Mark Zaid. Bolton has an obligation before publication to receive approval from the government. A lack of approval breaches his contractual obligation, and that has nothing to do with whether or not there's one word of classified information in the book, according to Zaid. Now, he definitely hasn't gotten approval, so it sounds like that he's not going to get his payday, which probably won't make Democrats cry.
Yeah.
Because the Democrats aren't very happy with Bolton at the moment, are they?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Bolton does say in the book, for instance, that he is not going to quote exactly what Trump said to President Xi about this apparent quid pro quo around China helping Trump win the election because he's not allowed to, because of White House lawyers having put the line through that.
Which what that tells you is that he had the quote.
Yeah.
Which is that the interesting thing about this book. I mean, yeah, Bolton's obviously not a neutral arbiter, as you say, and and at one point in time, I think he described, I've got it written down here, that the most irrational thing that Trump ever did, the most irrational thing I ever witnessed any president do, was to not launch military strikes after Iran shot down an unarmed drone.
Yeah, and that really, kind of conforms to the view of John Bolton as he never met a war he didn't like.
Yeah.
He was outraged that Trump, after finding out that retaliatory strike early in 2019 after the American drone was shot down, that this retaliatory strike, once Trump had already said, send the planes, he was told 150 civilians would die, and the president, some would argue to his credit, said, that's not a proportionate response. Bolton then argued, this isn't about proportionate, this is about being disproportionate because, Bolton's been wanting to bomb Iran for 20 years and President Trump ignored his response, which is part of the reason why President Trump and others refer to Bolton as a warmonger. He sees that taking a more assertive approach, whether it's against Iran or North Korea or indeed China, is what you should be doing, which put him firmly at odds with Trump.
Yeah, according to Bolton, that's the most irrational thing he ever witnessed.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he's obviously not a neutral arbiter, but on the other hand, he clearly took notes. Like
He's a big note taker.
Yeah, and he's got quotes coming out of his ears. Yeah. So, and no one would ever accuse Bolton of being dishonest. He's way too honest for his own good, I feel, a lot of the time. So there is a certain value there. But I do happen to, you mentioned that Bolton said he would have made no difference to the impeachment. I think that's an interesting thing to debate because you look at what he offers about the impeachment, like not only did he bring direct quotes, which were largely missing from the impeachment trial, if you recall, apart from Sondland's very foggy memory, but Bolton also brought what I think sounds kind of smoking gunnish. According to the New York Times, on August 20, so he's even got the dates here, Mr. Bolton writes, Mr. Trump said he wasn't in favour of sending them anything until all the Russia investigation materials related to Clinton and Biden had been turned over. Mr. Bolton writes that he, Mr. Pompeo and Defence Secretary Mark T. Esper tried 8 to 10 times to get Mr. Trump to release the aid. 8 to 10 times is a lot of direct contact with Trump talking about quid pro quo. So I think he could have bolstered their case.
Well, Bolton's argument was that there wasn't enough in that basically, as Republican Senator Lamar Alexander and others admitted before saying, we're not going to hear any evidence in the Senate, we're not going to subpoena Bolton, after Bolton had said, I will fight a subpoena if House Democrats subpoena me to appear, but I won't fight a subpoena if Senate Republicans ask me to appear. But he said that's safe in the knowledge that Republicans weren't going to subpoena him to appear, and also that he knew those Republican senators well enough. This is John Bolton, he's been around Washington for 40 years, and he knew that they were not going to vote to impeach Donald Trump. So it wasn't going to make a difference. So he was going to fight subpoenas if he was otherwise compelled to appear. So this stuff wouldn't even be out now. Those Bolton cases would not be resolved until after the election. So the impeachment inquiry would be continuing. Bolton's argument that that it shouldn't have just been about Ukraine, because if it had been also about China and Turkey, then maybe Senate Republicans couldn't have hidden from that. And at that point, it could have reached a tipping stage for at least a few more to break with the administration. But maybe he just made a very calculated decision based on self-preservation and his future as well.
I do think as well that even if they had more evidence, the Republicans weren't about to vote to impeach Trump, just for political reasons. And I think that would be a fair assessment. Having said that, I do actually think, ironically, politically, okay, leaving aside the impeachment, because I agree with Bolton that stretching it out a lot more would have been a much more effective impeachment. But and going broader. But
although in retrospect, of course, once COVID and the economy crashed,
I know, yeah,
the impeachment would have seemed like a monumental waste of everybody's time.
In hindsight, with COVID, that would have changed everything. But also, I feel like from a political point of view, from just base politics, Democrats made a good political decision because impeachment was a loser for them. You just need to look at the polls. Trump went from 41.6% to 46.1% during the impeachment process. They'd stretched that out. That's not helping the Democrats at all. So Bolton might have done them a favour in the end, to be honest.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, given that we're in an election year and they always have the kind of the cloak of democracy to say, well, if people really want to get rid of Donald Trump, they can do it at the ballot box in November. And that argument probably could have sustained them all year. But look, June is Supreme Court season as they clear the docket ahead of their long sun-filled days on Cape Cod or up in the Hamptons. And this week, there were two cases in particular that surprised many and disappointed one President Trump, who had hoped that the appointment of two Conservative justices would have tipped the balance more favourably towards Conservative rulings. But we talked about the discrimination in employment ruling on Wednesday night's Planet America, making it illegal to discriminate against gay or transgender people in the workplace. And earlier today came a slapdown of the Trump administration's push to overturn the Obama-era policy known as DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which prevented the deportation of undocumented immigrants who arrived in America as kids. And this potentially means 700,000 so-called dreamers that were potentially facing deportation have got another lifeline.
Yeah, the interesting thing about it is that all 9 judges agreed that Trump has the power to rescind DACA. It was just about process.
Yes.
Just about that he has to do it properly. He has to tick the right boxes. In particular, he needs to seek feedback from the community and particularly consider the hardship of the dreamers.
What are the implications of this?
Exactly, because they'd given all their details to the government and they were sitting ducks for deportation, essentially. And so Trump was supposed to consider their situation and to justify it. And his acting DHS Secretary Elaine Duke made no effort to do that whatsoever. So this is what Chief Justice Roberts said. We do not decide whether DACA or its rescission are sound policies. The wisdom of those decisions is none of our concern. We address only whether the agency complied with the procedural requirement that it provided a reasoned application for its action. Now, the strange bit about this is that there were actually 2 justifications. There was the first one from Duke, which was rubbish, and then Kirsten Nielsen came in later with a much better justification. But the majority held that only the first justification counted. They ignored the second one completely, except for Kavanaugh, whose dissent said, I would have counted the second one, and that was fine. But what we see here, John, is that once again, we see this all the time with the Trump administration, they have dodgy appointees who are shoddy and incompetent, and then Trump loses in court. This was, believe it or not, this was the 6th time. Trump has won 6 cases out of 85 in total so far, as far as administrative cases go, because they keep on stuffing up, ticking the right boxes. It's
that fundamental question of competency that Bolton turns to, and that people like Bolton justified ultimately going into the Trump administration when they saw that they'd run out of generals who hadn't flagged off Trump during 2016, and they kind of chewed through all of them. And so the lifers like Bolton, who have a private agenda that they want to push to start a few wars before the time runs out. But look, it was yet another example of really, it's basically saying sloppy homework. I'm not even looking at the substance of your arguments here. It's riddled with errors. It's funny. But the president, of course, far from happy, he immediately promised to put out a revised list of Conservative judges that he would pick for any future Supreme Court appointments in a hypothetical second term. Of course, it was just such a list that helped him shore up Conservative support in 2016. Plenty of Conservatives then didn't really like Donald Trump, but they certainly preferred who he was going to put on the court as opposed to Hillary Clinton. President Trump sent out a particularly inflammatory tweet earlier today aimed at those who fear that these progressive court justices are just itching to take away the guns of American people.
These horrible and politically charged decisions coming out of the Supreme Court are a shotgun blast into the face of the people that are proud to call themselves Republicans or conservatives. We need more justices or we will lose our Second Amendment and everything else. Vote Trump 2020.
See, the problem there is he's saying you need more conservative judges, yeah? Like Neil Gorsuch, the guy who earlier this week just broke the hearts of every conservative. Like that, they are not going to get over that for such a long time. It wasn't just that they've been dreading this kind of ruling about gay and transgender people for ages, Christian conservatives. But on top of that, Neil Gorsuch was the person who drove it, the actual person. That think about all the but Gorsuches you heard over the last 3 years. Well, we don't like Trump, but Gorsuch, we got Gorsuch. And then Gorsuch was the one. And not just did Gorsuch drive the stake, but his reasoning was so broad that they can then apply that to anything. Any kind of sexual discrimination in America now can be applied to transgender and gay people. And that is killing Christian conservatives. So for Trump to then float, well, you can get more conservative judges like I appointed before, that button ain't going to work. He can jam it as hard as he likes, but I think he might have lost some people.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what this new list, because the 2016 list was essentially just drafted by the Federalist Society, but this new list, is it going to have Trumpier candidates, not people like Neil Gorsuch, who will actually defy the kind of ideological expectations of who appointed them and their traditional approach, and that, so clearly there are, John Roberts over this court is so sensitive to the fact that he does not want this Supreme Court to be delegitimised for a generation because it is seen as being purely ideological, Trump's court, that Roberts got Gorsuch to write the opinion on the employment case, and that Roberts then voted with the progressive justices on the DACA case as well. I get the sense that that Chief Justice Roberts, probably when the history of this period is written, he will be seen as being a bit of a hero of the institution, regardless of what you believe on some of his rulings.
I'm not sure he'll be a hero to the right.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Look, the death last Friday now of 27-year-old Rashard Brooks at the hands of the Atlanta police gave renewed urgency to the Black Lives Matter protests and efforts to reform America's police forces. President Trump unveiled an executive order this week which doesn't so much reform as encourage reform. It doesn't seek to impose reforms as these various congressional bills that are floating around at the moment, Chaz, will seek to do.
Yeah, before we get to the reforms though, we've got to talk about that police shooting, because on Wednesday, I was wondering whether the officer might get off because people might regard a taser as likely to cause serious physical injury. Well, since then, Garrett Rolfe, the officer, has been charged with 11 crimes, including felony murder. They're going all the way to murder. And his mate, Devin Brosnan's facing 3 charges, including aggravated assault. So how did that happen? Felony murder means Rolfe committed some other crime on the way to killing Brooks. So what crime was that? Well, it turns out that there were 2 things we didn't know on Wednesday. One, that Rolfe's taser was already fully discharged and that Rolfe would have known that. So he knew he was in no danger from Brooks when Brooks pointed that taser at him. And 2, it turns out that Georgia police have a requirement to administer medical attention when someone is shot. And for 2 minutes and 12 seconds, those 2 cops did not administer any medical care. But what they did instead was this.
During the 2 minutes and 12 seconds that Officer Rolfe actually kicked Mr. Brooks while he laid on the ground, while he was there fighting for his life. Secondly, from the videotape, we were able to see that the other officer, Officer Brosnan, actually stood on Mr. Brooks's shoulders while he was there struggling for his life.
Okay, so one of the cops held him down after he'd been shot, the other one kicked him.
Yeah.
There's your felony. That's how you get felony murder.
Yeah.
And it's a lot uglier than we even thought it was on Wednesday.
It is a complicated and fascinating case, and it's going to be interesting to see what further evidence comes out. We've seen so much already from the bystanders and their mobile phone footage and the security footage from the drive-through section of the Wendy's restaurant. We've got almost a TikTok of every moment of this crime taking place, but we are learning some more details. What we've also got, though, is the audio that was being recorded, including by the police cameras on their uniforms, which is fascinating as well because it essentially details them doing a lot of things right. De-escalation techniques, the kinds of things that are being talked about in these reform bills. It was a very respectful, non-confrontational initial engagement.
Yeah.
Now, it clearly escalated and it got way out of hand and a man is dead. But it was really interesting just as we consider what reforms need to be done and what methods and what, this should be a key part of the training modules that every police officer go. Let's go through what did they do, where did they get it wrong, what did they do right, what did they do wrong? Because this did show, in a strange sort of way, this showed that progress has been made. This wasn't a simple case of cops itching to kill a black man, and it's not that many years since there was plenty of that going on.
Look, that is true, and it seems that the mistake they made was they never told him he was under arrest. Like they talked to him for ages, and then they grabbed his hands to restrain him, and that's when he flipped out. They never actually said that.
He talked about going to a relative's house, which was just nearby, and that he wasn't going to drive, and that he felt fine, and he could move the car to a parking area.
But having said all that, while I agree with all that, I just can't get past the holding the guy down and kicking him after you've shot him. That is a whole different world of brutality.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you that they should analyse that, but that second part was wow.
Yeah.
We should talk about reform though, because people definitely want changes. With a combined 59% of people now saying police departments across the country need either a complete overhaul or major reforms, only 5% saying no reforms are needed. And it's a tough topic for black people because you got a poll just now finding 50% of black people saying we need more cops on the street, more. But 49% of black people saying that when they personally see a police officer, it makes them feel less secure. So there's a real ambivalence there in the black community. Anyway, enter Trump. As you say, John, this is not his head of power. He can only do so much. And basically, he's proposing to bribe police departments with federal grants. And what he's proposing to bribe them to do is to get police departments certified for following best possible practices. And look, I'm not sure police departments have poor official practices at the moment. That's not the problem. The problem is people not following the practices. But anyway, can't hurt. Good try. Why not? He wants them to create a national excessive force database. Sounds like a great idea because there are actually no national databases right now, amazingly. But the weird thing is, in his executive order, it's just for police departments. I think it really should be made public because as of 2015, only 27 states made their discipline records available to some degree to the public. And to be blunt, police departments don't care if their police have a record of abuse. In Florida, right now, 3% of all full-time law enforcement officers working in Florida have been fired before from other Florida agencies for misconduct. 3% of them. Okay, so put some public pressure on these guys so you don't hire cops who have shown misconduct in the past. Trump wants to ban chokeholds, except in self-defense, but watch out again, devil's in the details. He's defining chokeholds as a physical maneuver that restricts an individual's ability to breathe for the purposes of incapacitation, but restricting the airway, John, is just one kind of neck restraint. The other kind blocks the carotid artery. That's the kind that Chauvin was trying to apply to George Floyd. So that executive order might not necessarily have helped George Floyd out. So just need to know that. He wants to train officers for mental health issues. That sounds good. And he wants to encourage social workers to ride along with the police. That sounds good as well. 70% of the calls New Orleans police responded to in 2019 were classified as checks on property and people. 70%. So social workers would presumably be handy for a few of them. And hopefully one day social workers can take care of some of those calls by themselves. Not earth-shattering reforms overall, but yeah, there's something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of that sounds really great, and a lot of it could be great. And the idea of de-policing rather than defunding police to sort of say, look, we're going to send in social work and mental health experts into a lot of situations, including domestic violence situations, that is a way of managing this. But unfortunately, as we saw in the case of Rashard Brooks, this started off as a case of a guy who wasn't agitated, he wasn't he wasn't stealing anything, he wasn't doing anything except he had fallen asleep while waiting to go through a drive-through restaurant at 10:30 on a Friday night. And when people spoke to him, he seemed kind of drunk. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't threatening anyone. So the police turn up and it's all pretty cash. until it's not.
That's why
you
I said
don't
in
bring
the
a mental
social
health
workers.
expert along with you in the squad car because somebody's fallen asleep in a drive-through at a Wendy's.
No, but if the social worker is the person who's calling in the first place, there's no cops with guns,
Yeah.
then maybe this isn't a problem.
Yeah.
I guess we'll see. Anyway, there's lots more than this, but we're in a bit of a rush. So I'll talk more about what Democrats and Republicans are proposing in Congress on the PET podcast. But I'll tell you what probably won't work.
Yes.
This.
Now, some cities are trying new approaches, like in Seattle, where protesters have set up camp around an abandoned police precinct, calling it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ. A rare instance of the name Chaz appearing in the news without the words intoxicated and catamaran.
That's a good line.
It is. And it's right too.
Yes, it is, alas. Look, I was very interested in these guys. You'd never guess why. But then they changed their name to CHOP, the Capitol Hill Organised Protest, and then I lost complete interest in them. But Tucker Carlson hasn't lost interest in them. He's been making fun of them all week.
There it is. Documentary evidence of life inside CHOP. Chopistani is going about their business. Chopistani Customs in action. We should warn you, though, what you just saw is just a snapshot. The nation of CHOP is dynamic. It's changing even as we watch.
Honestly, 10 minutes every night he's talking about the Chopistanis and showing footage.
They don't
like
seem to be
that.
able to figure out, are these people ridiculous hippies or are they Antifa terrorists who are taking over Seattle as a first step to taking over all of America?
Yeah, Fox, they can't make up their mind. Because Tucker Carlson, clearly, he's not taking them too seriously. But then Fox they've used photos from the Minnesota riots and they've just put Seattle underneath it. They're really trying to ramp up the danger, other elements of Fox. So, but I mean, they've become comic relief, at least for Tucker Carlson. So I'm not sure that's what they were aiming for.
Yeah, all right. Let's look at the politics of the week, and there were some more encouraging polls for former Vice President Joe Biden's White House hopes, leading by 9 points nationally, according to YouGov, and 10 points according to Change Research. Feed those into the polling average, and Biden has extended his lead to 8.5 points. And I'm going to let Fox News deliver their latest poll results from earlier today.
Tonight, Joe Biden is increasing his lead over President Trump in brand new Fox polls releasing right now. The presumptive Democratic nominee holding a 50-38 advantage among registered voters. That is a 4-point gain from last month in this poll. The president's job approval numbers holding steady at 44% positive, 55% negative.
Now, a couple of things to say about that, Chaz. First of all, last week when CNN had Biden leading by 14, the Trump campaign sent a cease and desist letter saying, pull down that poll and apologise. Now Fox News has got one saying he's 12 points up. As we go to air, we haven't heard anything from the president. But the other point in that, 44% approve of Trump, 38% are going to vote for Trump. Now that disconnect between approval and voting intention is interesting. When it gets to around 6 points, we're talking beyond margin of error. We're talking about people who are going, OK, Trump's doing OK, but I don't want him again. I don't want to re-elect this guy.
That's a surprise.
It is a surprise.
I don't really understand that.
Yeah. We'll just have to watch that as to whether, because we keep focusing on Trump's approval, but so many of his polls now, head-to-head, state polls, etc., he's getting into the 30s, even though he's still kind of resilient in the low to mid-40s on approval. But Joe Biden better not start measuring up the curtains for the Oval Office just yet. That Change Research poll I showed you earlier also found a string of swing states are quite close. Trump is just 3 points behind in Pennsylvania, just 2 points behind in Michigan, although another Michigan poll this week had Biden leading by 16 points. Joe Biden's 7-point lead, though, in this poll in Florida will send a few chills through the Trump campaign. No wonder they want Trump's renomination speech to be held in Florida instead of North Carolina now. Biden is 2 points up in North Carolina, 1 in Arizona, and 4 points in Wisconsin. Wisconsin still seen by many as maybe the tipping point, if not the bellwether in this election. So maybe that Wisconsin number is a pretty good guide of where we're up to at the moment. In the average of Wisconsin polls, Biden is leading by over 5 points.
Yeah, and if he wins Wisconsin, that is the election.
It feels like the ball game, doesn't it? And Joe Biden's not just doing well in a lot of the polls right now, he's also getting a few outside assists from groups like Republican Voters Against Trump. This one features Senator Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator who has become one of the president's staunchest supporters in Congress, at least publicly, after once being one of his strongest critics. That change in context only makes his endorsement of Joe Biden and his attack on Trump all the more poignant. Take a look.
Well, I want to talk to the Trump supporters for a minute. What is Donald Trump's campaign about? He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. And you know how you make America great again? Tell Donald Trump to go to hell. If you can't admire Joe Biden as a person, then it's probably you got a problem. You need to do some self-evaluation, because what's not to like? He is as good a man as God ever created. He said some of the most incredibly heartfelt things that anybody could ever say to me. He's the nicest person I think I've ever met in politics. This is a defining moment in the future of the Republican Party. We have to reject this demagoguery, and if we don't reject Donald Trump, we've lost the moral authority, in my view, to govern this great nation.
So what do you think has a greater impact? The words of Lindsey Graham from 2016 saying nice things about Joe Biden and bad things about Trump, which we now know Lindsey doesn't believe, or at least doesn't state publicly, or someone like John Bolton saying this guy's unfit to be president of the United States?
I don't think anyone cares what John Bolton has to say, to be honest. So I would, I don't think John Bolton's got some big fan club because, if John Bolton doesn't like him. And also, I think we're getting numb to ex-Trump officials bagging out Trump. That happens a lot these days. But I don't think Lindsey Graham bagging out Trump would necessarily have much of an effect because we're used to that as well from 2016. His words about Biden, I think they could resonate a little because
finest man I've met in politics.
Yeah, he didn't just say, I like Biden. That was a real endorsement of Biden. Now, obviously, we know that this is from taken out of context, all the rest of it, but still, like those words, I think if that has any effect, that would be the effect. It would be a positive for Biden rather than negative for Trump. So it's poor old Lindsey Graham. He's going to be a punching bag for the next few months, isn't he?
Fascinating to see how he plays in the next few months. Now, just as he did in 2016, President Trump has questioned whether this year's election will be conducted fairly, making a number of unfounded allegations about voter fraud, particularly when it comes to mail-in ballots. Joe Biden said just last week he is concerned that President Trump is preparing to steal the election or refuse to accept defeat. President Trump was asked about those comments in a Fox News interview this week.
Look, Joe's not all there. Everybody knows it. And it's sad when you look at it and you see it. You see it for yourself. He's created his own sanctuary city in the basement of wherever he is. And he doesn't come out. And certainly if I don't win, I don't win. I mean, I go on and do other things. I think it would be a very sad thing for our country.
Yeah, pretty classic Trump attack on Biden there. Nicely delivered.
Yeah, it was actually.
But look, not everyone's convinced that President Trump will actually just go, okay, I'll go and, go back to New York. Our next guest says that the US system of government may not even be able to cope with a president who refuses to leave office. Joining us is Lawrence Douglas. He's law professor at Amherst College and author of the new book, Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Election Meltdown of 2020. Professor Douglas, thanks for having a Fireside Chat.
My pleasure to be with you.
How likely do you think it is that President Trump will refuse to concede defeat in November?
Well, I think one thing that is important to distinguish is refusing to concede and refusing to submit. By conceding, I mean like recognizing the legitimacy of a defeat. And I don't think there's any way that he's going to recognize that he legitimately lost. We see a pretty consistent pattern throughout his rather short political career that he always attributes loss to fraud or to some kind of hoax. He did that during the primaries when he was still a Republican candidate. That's somewhat different from the question of submitting to defeat. So, my book is not necessarily about imagining Trump barricaded in the White House come January 20th, surrounded by rogue Secret Service agents. But I do think that he will refuse to concede And as a result of that, it's more than likely that we could see a lot of electoral chaos in the United States between November 3rd, which is when the nation goes to the polls, and January 20th, which is when the new president is inaugurated.
So what is the scenario that you're considering? What are the key questions that could confront us in November?
Well, I think the key problem is, as your viewers might be well aware, the United States has a very, very unusual way of electing the president. We don't rely on a direct national popular vote. We rely on this very antiquated, anachronistic electoral college system, which awards the entirety of an electoral college votes of a state, depending on who wins the state's popular vote. And what can happen, and we saw this very dramatically in the year 2000, and to some degree also in 2016, is the election can turn on these razor slim margins in a handful of swing states. And if it does, it creates a very powerful opportunity for a candidate, or in this case, an incumbent, to argue that, well, there were irregularities in that particular state. And the irregularities in that particular state have cost me the electoral college votes in that state and the election as a whole. And I worry about that particularly with regards to this coming November, inasmuch as we know that with the pandemic upon us, that this is going to be quite an irregular election. That is, there are going to be tens of millions of Americans voting by mail-in ballot. Those mail-in ballots often are not counted until days or even weeks after the nation goes to the polls. And it creates many opportunities for someone like a Trump to say, we can't accept these mail-in ballots. There's all sorts of irregularities associated with them. It's very easy for him to turn a story of irregularities into a story of conspiracy. And we've seen him already starting to trot out the story in his attacks on mail-in ballots in the last couple of weeks.
Professor, most of the swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, they've got Democratic state secretaries. So if they certify the election results, wouldn't that be okay?
Again, this requires us to dig down into the kind of the Byzantine qualities of the American electoral system. But you're correct in that the Democrats could, that is, Democratic executives in the swing states could certify results given Biden the electoral college votes. However, in those same three states, we have divided government. That is, the state legislatures are controlled by Republicans. In the case of Wisconsin and Michigan, very Trump-supportive Republicans. And again, in the case of razor-slim outcomes, we could imagine that the state Republicans buy into Trump's narrative of voter fraud and irregularities. And as a result of that, they assign the electoral college votes to Trump. And then you could have a circumstance in which two sets of electoral certificates will end up in the lap of Congress come January 6th. January 6th is the date on which Congress opens the electoral certificates and counts them. It's meant to be a largely ceremonial function that doesn't last particularly long. But it is possible that you could have this kind of scenario because we've had it before in American history. We had it in 1876 and it almost tore the nation apart.
So you're saying that state legislatures, even if they can't overrule state secretaries' certification of results, they can confuse matters completely?
Exactly. Because even as you suggested, it is the state secretary or the governor who under federal law is required to submit the certificate to Congress. Nothing bars the legislature from submitting its own certificate. So whereas the governor or the secretary has to submit a certificate, the legislature certainly could. And if you have conflicting certificates that arrive in Congress, and if you have a divided Congress like we have now, there's really no way to work yourself out of that problem. It could turn into this complete electoral stalemate in which Congress is unable to decide who has received the majority of electoral college votes.
Okay, so what happens if these issues aren't resolved? Because the clock is ticking at midday on the 20th of January. The president is out of office.
That's exactly right. According to the Constitution, his term ends as of noon on January 20th. And so, you know, there are various scenarios. There's one in which Congress just continues to fight over these electoral certificates and just can't figure out a way out of the stalemate, and that stalemate continues until January 20th. There's also a possible scenario in which Congress decides, okay, we're just going to throw out those electoral certificates from the swing states. We can't decide what to do with them. In which case, if no one has a majority of electoral college votes, then it becomes the House of Representatives that ends up electing the President of the United States. And this is kind of interesting. Even among many of my colleagues, I have colleagues who have said, oh, well, that looks pretty good for Biden since the Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives. And yet that's not what the Constitution says. The Constitution does not empower each member of the House to vote if the election ends up in the hands of the House of Representatives. It gives one vote to each state delegation. And right now, the Republicans actually have a narrow lead in state delegations, 26 to 23, with one state delegation tied. But it is also the case that it's not the present Congress that would be choosing the president. It would be the Congress that's inaugurated itself on January 3rd. And it's very easy to imagine that that Congress could be divided 25 to 25 in state delegations, that House, in which case you don't get a president-elect. You have stalemate.
Wow. Well, if this does become a massive mess, though, can the Supreme Court sort it out?
Not necessarily, because as we recall in the year 2000, the Supreme Court stepped in. And many people think about, well, it was the Supreme Court that brought necessary closure to the election confusion of 2000. But I think that's also kind of, first of all, I think that's a mistake. I don't think it was the Supreme Court that brought closure. I really think it was Al Gore, because Al Gore accepted a very poorly reasoned and highly partisan decision by the Supreme Court. And there were many people within the Democratic Party who were urging Gore to take the fight to Congress. Now, if he had done so, and if things spell out in the way that I've just been describing to you, that competing electoral certificates land in Congress's lap, it's not at all clear that the Supreme Court under the Constitution has any say whatsoever in resolving that kind of dispute. It's not clear that I think many experts, many constitutional experts would say the Supreme Court has no role to play once an electoral dispute lands in Congress's hand. The one thing that we could look to is there is this Presidential Succession Act of 1947, which is if we don't get any president-elect by January 20th, then Nancy Pelosi could be sworn in as the acting president, assuming that she steps down from her speakership. But again, we have to bear in mind that would probably be playing itself out against the backdrop of a President Trump tweeting away, insisting that the Democrats are trying to steal his electoral victory and that he remains the rightful president of the United States.
Professor Douglas, thank you very much for having a Fireside Chat.
Oh, my pleasure talking with you. A real pleasure.
Now, before we go, Chaz, while much of America has reopened in recent weeks and we're getting all sorts of other news happening, we mustn't forget there is still a pandemic out there. What's the latest?
Look, not a lot has changed since Wednesday, John. Arizona, Florida, Texas, they're still a worry. In fact, 10 states are seeing their highest 7-day average of new corona cases per day since the pandemic started. By the way, one of those 10 states is where Trump is holding his big rally this weekend, Oklahoma. Only 200 cases a day there, but those cases are rising rapidly. And for a bit of a change, let's look at America in an international context. America has now climbed to 7th in the world for deaths per capita and starting to close in on France as well. By the way, look at all those South American countries rising up that chart. South America is the new Europe. And talking about Europe, these are the EU deaths per capita over time, and these are America's, moved 12 days earlier so the curves line up. The curves are almost identical, except the EU deaths have trailed right off, and America's not so much, John.
Not good indeed. And that is it for another Fireside Chat. We will see you for Planet America Wednesday night, 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV.
And do not forget the Pet Podcast, where we'll be asking, why is America fighting to protect torturers? But for now, we will leave you with the curious goings-on at Venture County Board of Supervisors. Enjoy.
Bye.
I am a proud Trump Republican Trump Republican yearning to be free again. Shame on all of you. Let liberty ring. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her. God bless America, my home, sweet home. Let liberty ring!
Thank you for your comments.